They were the first truly global empire and the first nation to reach the fourth technological singularity, but today they seem to be in full decline. We're talking about the United Kingdom, which, despite not having the glory and vigor of the past, still controls a shadowy and sinister discrete financial empire that still interferes with the balance of world power. In today's video, we'll discuss the United Kingdom's geopolitics. But before that, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, share the video with everyone you know, and turn on the notification bell to stay up to date with the channel's news. Or follow us on our other networks, Instagram and Telegram, whose links are in the video description. My name is Geopolitical Mundial and this is the channel Geopolitical Mundial. The United Kingdom is located in Western Europe. It includes the island of Great Britain, the surrounding islands, and a part of Ireland. The country is surrounded by the Atlantic Ocean, the North Sea, the Irish Sea, and the English Channel. Its geopolitical core is consolidated in the plains of the English core, which covers the part of England that lies between London to the south, Birmingham to the west, Leeds to the north, and Cambridge to the east. Its 12,500-kilometer coastline has historically served as a formidable defense, making it difficult for invaders coming from continental Europe. If not completely blocking, at least making it as difficult as possible for foreign forces to occupy, with only rare exceptions having succeeded. Thus, in English territory, English leaders were able to focus on consolidating their nation-state without major external interference. However, its ancient history and mountainous geography favored the emergence of extremely strong regional identities. This led to a very divided power structure for a region of medium size. This caused the island of Great Britain to be divided into independent nations, such as England, where more than 80% of the population lives, Scotland and Wales. And they also administer, outside the island, the area of Northern Ireland, where they share a border with Ireland. Historically, ironically, due to this difficulty with internal administration, the English ended up developing a unique perception and skill for handling and managing diverse and confusing political groups through complicated agreements among the various clans that existed in the region. This would be extremely useful for them in the future, once they finally consolidated their internal power structure. The English were then able to focus their efforts on building a powerful navy that would serve to both protect the British Isles and provide agile, mobile access to take conflicts into Europe. This was part of a strategy of division and strategic alliances that were not permanent, which prevented their continental European rivals from building forces large enough to put Great Britain in a defensive position, while also not being strong enough to conquer or subdue Europe completely. The English strategy was traditionally to support the weaker states against the stronger ones, in order to achieve a regional balance. And as soon as that weaker side became too strong and now threatened to dominate the rest of the continent, the English would simply change their alliances to then strengthen their former rivals, even if that meant supporting their previous rival to face their former ally. The strategy was simple, but it was enough so that, for centuries, no empire in Europe could swallow the entire continent, and Europe always remained divided among itself. This skill, acquired and developed over several centuries in managing diversity and rivalries, was simply expanded to a larger scale. As they built a global-scale empire, they applied the same strategy now in Africa and Asia. Due to the fact that it is an island relatively lacking in large quantities of natural resources, the English have always had to seek most of their resources outside the British Isles. However, the situation would finally change in the 17th century and the early 18th century when, luckily for them, a series of external and internal factors would flow in the same direction. Favorable because, given the fact that they had few internal resources and did not yet have large colonies in the Americas, Africa, or Asia that could provide a large quantity of precious minerals. unlike the already established and powerful Portuguese and Spanish empires. The English had to develop a civilization that could not be based solely on extraction, so they had to develop a powerful industry that would generate wealth to compete with their European rivals. And, in the middle of the 18th century, it would become the birthplace of the fourth technological singularity, the Industrial Revolution. And just by luck, the English core was located right on top of some of the largest coal and iron reserves in Europe, which are vital for the industry of that time, which, on top of that, were interconnected by navigable rivers. This industrial merchant culture, combined with this new technology and geographic coincidence, would indeed create the largest territorial empire in history. The British Empire, which became the greatest military force in Europe and the world's leading technological and industrial power at the time. Now, with great strides in superior technology and an unparalleled industry, the British Empire would gradually establish itself over the world. This, in the following centuries, would also be boosted by the generous reserves of gas and oil in the British Isles to the east and in Scotland, which gave them deep technical knowledge in extracting oil at great depths. And it would help establish partnerships with countries that had energy reserves but didn't have the technology, machinery, or workforce needed to exploit such resources. In other words, thanks to this, Great Britain had access to direct energy sources in its own territory exclusively for itself, unlike its European rivals who had to compete with each other for access to these resources, especially France and Germany. On one hand, during the 800 years between 1000 and 1800, the Kingdom of England was on an equal footing with other European empires and kingdoms, in a scenario where no European country could ever surpass the others too much. From the late 18th century and finally in the 19th century, the situation would change drastically. First, with the Acts of Union of 1707, when the kingdoms of England and Scotland were unified into a single state. And later, the Act of Union of 1800, which merged the Kingdom of Ireland with the Kingdom of Great Britain. But besides these technological, industrial, and geopolitical aspects, which were fundamental for England, there is still the driving force at the epicenter of its geopolitics, which would truly transform England into this first global power. That driving force was conquering the Indian subcontinent. Since Napoleon's fall in the early 19th century, the British Empire would compete with the Russian Empire for global influence, and for that the conquest of Eurasia was vital. While Moscow would push south and east from the center of the Eurasian landmass, London chose a containment solution from the sea, using countries hostile to the Russians to do their work, like the Ottoman Turkish Empire from the western Middle East, the Persian Empire from the south, and the Japanese Empire in the Far East. Meanwhile, they would directly focus their efforts from the Indian subcontinent and China towards the north, and this strategy was successful. Controlling the Indian subcontinent would position the British at the heart of the Indian Ocean, enabling force projection to key regional points. While it still provided a vast amount of food products for its global empire and labor for the construction of its railways and armed forces. It's no wonder that the region of India was called the jewel in the British crown. However, there is a very important factor to mention that either goes unnoticed by the unaware or is simply ignored by the dishonest, which is the fact that unlike their European rivals, the British focused on building an organic empire, that is, one for the long term. That's why, instead of having only extractive empires or ones that served as military outposts, the British, throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, they used their power by investing in spreading their educational and scientific model around the world, which included their colonies, as well as, and it's also important to mention, building infrastructure in the conquered regions, such as railways, roads, basic sanitation, ports, and so on. And most importantly, fighting slavery and banning practices that today would be considered atrocious. Even for those who defend cultural relativism, for example, by banning the requirement in some Indian cultures to burn widows alive after their husbands' deaths. That's why, even though the English made many mistakes, some of which would cause historic humanitarian disasters, like the Great Famine in India in 1943 or the explosion of drug consumption in China after the Opium War, overall, the contribution of the British Empire was notable for the progress of humanity. So, even though obviously such exports of cultural values and ideals did not have a humanitarian goal, these constructions, methodologies, and the introduction of westernized and modern values did leave a positive legacy and heritage for their former colonies, even today. Thanks to this factor, the English are able to maintain close and collaborative relationships with most of their former colonies, even after they began their independence processes of independence that would start to spread. Not by coincidence, it was right after Indian independence, that is, right after the loss of their crown jewel. This would become notoriously clear in 1956, when France and England, in partnership with Israel, would intervene in a failed and disastrous way in the Suez Strait, after the Egyptian president al-Nasser nationalized the canal. The threat of war from the Soviet Union and the lack of American support made London quickly realize that they were no longer the power they once were, and that now they could do nothing to prevent the independence of their former colonies, encouraged by the new global geopolitical scenario, which was now controlled by the geopolitical titans of the United States and the Soviet Union. And here, again, the English set themselves apart from other Europeans, because unlike them, like the French, Belgians, or even the Portuguese, the English did not resist this decolonization as much. On the contrary, they gave it up, in most cases even willingly, in exchange for maintaining their commercial networks with the new independent countries and for large loans of money to the elites who would govern these new countries. So, while the other Europeans, out of stubbornness, would spend the next decades in agonizing and endless wars with their colonies, the English quietly stitched together the beginnings of a much more skeletal, obscure, and hyper-efficient financial empire. And just as important was the fact that the English maintained control over it. 14 overseas territories, 12 of which are small but strategic islands in the Atlantic Ocean, Caribbean, Mediterranean, Indian Ocean, and Pacific Ocean. Maintaining control over these territories means that even today, despite all the difficulties, British air and naval power can still influence some of the main geopolitical hotspots in the world, such as the Straits of Gibraltar and Suez in the Mediterranean, projecting influence over European affairs, as well as the north and south of Africa. Caribbean, projecting influence over the north of South America and connecting the Atlantic Ocean to the Panama Canal, which leads to the Pacific Ocean. Where is the other British strategic point? A corridor of islands along the South Atlantic, influencing the western coast of South America and the eastern coast of Africa, as if it were a kind of column or corridor. In other words, projecting capability over the alternative to the Suez Canal and the Panama Canal in case of conflict that I just mentioned. And the Central Indian Ocean, where it closely observes the important Straits of Malacca, Sunda, Hormuz, Bab el-Mandeb, and the Mozambique Channel. Therefore, to have influence over global maritime trade, the British would no longer need an extensive naval fleet and a huge line of soldiers. It would be enough to maintain control over these areas, because the one who could do the heavy lifting for England would be its rebellious child, the United States. With the British Navy lacking its former strength, the powerful United States Navy took prominence. It would use the British territories to have this global projection, with both sides benefiting mutually. The Americans, who wouldn't have to worry about occupying territories that were already strategically positioned and had existing infrastructure, and the British, who would have the world's greatest military power, defending their own interests as well without having to bear the risks of exposure, and even more benefited. Behind this transition was also the British nobility, connected with international banks, who would later turn these 14 possessions into tax havens. From then on, London would exercise its soft power by lending to nations in need, or even more importantly, to political leaders or influential people in strategic countries. This measure allowed the English to maintain connections with their former colonies through their leadership. This not only guaranteed the maintenance of commercial relations, but more importantly, kept the English as influential actors within the governments of developing or underdeveloped countries, and kept London as a dynamic and influential player in geopolitics. Even from the second half of the 20th century, with the United Kingdom having to resist being swallowed by the increasingly heavy gravity of Europe, which would increase even more after the unification of Germany and the consolidation of the European Union. By the end of the century, the British managed the feat of remaining, even in decline, as autonomous actors, mainly strengthening political actors from countries within the community. Of the nations that are still strategically positioned around the world to try to contain potential actors they consider hostile, especially Iran, China, and Russia. The English strategy is not only cheap, but also absurdly profitable. Although it has a problem, it is risky because it depends on the strong arms of the United States to ensure that its ties are maintained and fulfilled. So, two questions will define the future of this British Empire. 2.0. The first is how long the interests of Washington and London will remain aligned. And the second is how much of England will survive and what it will look like, as immigrants hostile to the English people and culture substantially increase their presence in the country. Thank you all, I hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to share the video with everyone you know to help the channel keep growing. And also consider becoming a member of the channel. Not only will you get early access to videos and exclusive members-only content, like for example the podcasts and course videos I'm giving, but also access to the exclusive members group on Telegram. And this will really help the channel to keep going. Hugs, and see you in the next video.